that it's biased against Israel. An argument could plausibly be made in that regard had it been the case that this opinion of the World Court had it been close. But what's remarkable about the opinion is it wasn't close at all. The vote was 14-1. The one dissenting vote, to which I'll return in a moment, was by the judge from the United States, Judge Bergenthal. But this was a remarkably uncontentious vote. Even on issues which you would think were no-brainers, take the question of the legality of nuclear weapons. In 1996, the International Court of Justice was called upon to render a decision on whether the threat and use of nuclear weapons was legal under international law. To simplify matters, but not, I don't think, to falsify them, to simplify matters, the most fundamental principle of international law when it comes to war, it's called the principle of distinction. That is, the distinction between combatants and civilians. And under international law, you're not allowed to target civilians, only combatants. Everyone in this room knows that. Well, the question arose, given that nuclear weapons cannot discriminate between civilians and combatants, they're incapable of making that discrimination by their nature, are these weapons legal? It would seem to a layperson, well, the answer has to be no. Nonetheless, on that particular question, the vote was very close. It was a tie, and it was broken by the president of the court at the time. So even on that fairly straightforward question, it was very close. But on this question, it wasn't close at all. The vote was 14-1. Or take another example. Some of you in this room have memories that go back to the U.S. illegal war against Nicaragua in the 1980s. And in 1984, the Nicaraguan government took its case to the World Court, whether it was illegal for the United States to mine the harbors of Nicaragua. Again, when you look at the court decision, once more, it seems like a no-brainer. But when you look at the court decision and you look at what's called the opinion, then the separate opinions, then the declarations and the dissents, it's not so complicated, but it's a complicated procedure. It comes to a hefty 1,000 or so pages of debate, discussion, and exposition. But when you come to this particular case, the one on borders, settlements, Jerusalem, the whole thing, main opinions, separate opinions, declarations, dissent, the whole thing comes to less than 100 pages. The point being, there's nothing to debate. There's nothing to discuss. These are the most basic principles of international law. You're not allowed to conquer territory by war. For those of you whose memories reach back to 1990, 1991, that was exactly the statement that President Bush Sr. said to Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. It's illegal to acquire territory by war. The settlements, it's a no-brainer. The language in Article 49 couldn't be clearer. And Jerusalem was conquered in war. As I said, even the case of Judge Bergenthal, who cast not a dissent, but he used the more neutral language, what's called, in the parlance of the International Court, it's called a declaration. He begins his declaration by saying that there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And then, remarkably, bear in mind, this was the only negative vote. Judge Bergenthal says, on what's the crucial question really, namely those settlements which constitute the main obstacle to resolving the conflict, Bergenthal says there can't be any question. Those settlements, says the American judge, who incidentally is also a Holocaust survivor, but the American judge says as well, those settlements are illegal under international law. And he goes on to say, if Israel is building the wall to incorporate the settlements, then he says that wall is, quote, ipso facto illegal under international law, which is to say that on the fundamental questions, what we're told in the public arena are so controversial, so complex, that they have to be put off to the final stages of negotiations, that the entire court, all 15 judges, agree there's a consensus on what is right and what is wrong, what is legal and what is not in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that returns me to the topic this evening. If it's true that even on these most contentious issues, there's no contention at all, then how do you account for all the controversy? Before I get to that, I want to use this time to just briefly review what that record shows. Obviously, time doesn't allow me to go into any depth or detail, but I can illustrate the point with several examples. So let me begin with the history. I notice there are a few oldsters in the room still wearing their tie-dyed T-shirts and their love beads, still chanting, "Give peace a chance," and still stoned. I went to a potluck dinner this evening. There was no luck and there was no pot. Just potato chips. For those people whose memories stretch back in the Israel-Palestine conflict, the most controversial question in the history of the conflict, I think people will agree, and I would want, of course, to hear from you if you don't, but the question always used to arise, say in the 70s and the 80s, the question always used to arise was, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? For those of you who are new to the topic, in November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly votes to partition Palestine. And almost immediately after the partition resolution is passed, a civil war breaks out in Palestine. And then in May 1948, when Israel declares its independence, an interstate war breaks out in the area, or I should say in Palestine. January 1949, when the interstate war ends, approximately 750,000 Palestinians find themselves outside of their homes in the area that became Israel. And the question arose from there on, how did those Palestinians become refugees? The standard claim of Israel, and it became the claim which was echoed in mainstream scholarship. The claim was, in 1948, the Arab armies from neighboring states stood poised to invade the newly born state of Israel. They then transmitted radio broadcasts to the Palestinian population to leave their homes, clear the way for the invading Arab armies, and once the Arab armies had thrown the Jews into the sea, the Palestinian Arabs would be able to return to their homes. How many people are familiar with that argument that used to be made? Raise your hands up high. As you can see, that was what we were told. And as I said, it was the dominant claim in most of the scholarship on the topic. Come the late 1980s, a large number of researchers, notably the Israeli historian Benny Morris, investigates the record, and Morris, like all the other historians, reaches the conclusion there's no basis for this claim of Arab radio broadcasts. It was simply fabricated. And Morris then went on in later years to acknowledge, and I'm using his words, that what happened in Palestine in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing, his phrase. And that has now become the broad consensus among historians. There is some debate, I don't want to dispute that, but the amount of debate is relatively narrow. The question arises, was this ethnic cleansing premeditated, that is to say, intentional, or was it simply the consequence of war? We all know wars breed refugees, and was it just an accidental consequence of war? Morris held the position that it was an accidental outcome of the war. But to give you an indication how narrow the debate is, you take the case of Shlomo Ben-Ami. He's Israel's former foreign minister, the foreign minister in the late 1990s through 2000. He's a very smart guy. He's a historian by training. A few years ago, he wrote a book entitled Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, came out from Oxford University Press, and he, at some point, has to address that question, how the Palestinians become refugees. And he says, well, I agree with Morris. It's clear from the record that they were ethnically cleansed in 1948. But, he says, and here we're speaking about the former foreign minister, but he says, I don't agree with Morris. It wasn't accidental. He says it was, to quote his words, it was anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer. In layperson's language, all along the Zionist movement was intending to expel the indigenous population. Come 1948, under the cover of war, it had the opportunity to do so, and then it did what it had always intended to do. And so now you have the remarkable fact that on what used to be considered the most contentious issue in the history of the conflict, Israel's former foreign minister taking the most extreme position critical of the state of Israel. Another interesting example, and for those of you who are readers, and I hope that phenomenon still exists, there's a very excellent book that recently came out. I couldn't recommend it more highly, by an Israeli, the former head of Israel's most prominent center for the study of strategy. His name, the center is called the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University, and the author's name is Ze'ev Maoz, M-A-O-Z, and the book is called Defending the Holy Land. And what the book is, it's basically a review of the whole history of Arab-Israeli wars. Who started what and why?